There are times in history when questions linger longer than answers, when the silence between written records seems louder than the chronicles that survive. One of these questions begins with a name that feels both familiar and strange: Tartaria. For centuries, maps across Europe labelled a vast swathe of territory, stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean with that title. And yet, if one searches the historical record, Tartaria does not stand among the great empires with well-documented lineages, monarchs and wars. It appears suddenly on the page and then, with equal suddenness, it fades away. How could such an immense space, marked so consistently in maps and accounts, leave so little behind? Was Tartaria an invention of cartographers? Or could it have been a civilization so radically different, and perhaps so threatening to accepted narratives, that later powers ensured its erasure? This is where the story begins. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment with your location and your local time. It always amazes me to think of so many of us gathering across different corners of the world to consider the mysteries of history together. The old maps are perhaps the most tangible starting point. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European cartographers consistently filled Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of northern China with a single unifying label: Tartaria. The name varied in its spelling: Tartary, Tartaria, or Great Tartary, but its placement was remarkably consistent. The territory described was immense, rivaling the combined size of all of Europe. Early modern atlases by Gerardus Mercator, Abraham Ortelius, and later French and Dutch cartographers included the word without hesitation. Yet these same works, otherwise meticulous in marking political borders, rivers and towns, gave astonishingly little detail about who the Tartars were, how their empire functioned, or what its internal divisions might have been. Historians today often argue that Tartaria was more a geographic placeholder than a political entity. According to this interpretation, it represented the unknown lands of Asia, inhabited by nomadic tribes but lacking centralized authority. However, that explanation does not fully account for the way Tartaria was described by certain travellers and diplomats. For example, scattered references in Jesuit mission reports speak of grand settlements, walled cities, and traditions unfamiliar to both Russians and Chinese. The accounts are fragmentary, but they raise questions about whether Tartaria might have been more than a cartographic convenience. The problem of erasure compounds the mystery. By the late 18th century, Tartaria began to vanish from maps altogether. In its place appeared the expanding Russian Empire, Qing China, and a more detailed patchwork of Central Asian Khanates. The shift was not gradual. In some cases, maps printed only a decade apart revealed Tartaria in one edition and its total disappearance in the next. Scholars debate whether this was simply a matter of improved geographic knowledge or something more intentional. Was an entire civilization reclassified under new names, its identity lost in translation, or perhaps deliberately overwritten by imperial powers eager to impose their authority? One theory proposes that Tartaria was never a single empire, but a network of advanced cultures sharing architectural styles and technologies. The evidence most often cited lies not in manuscripts but in stone and brick. Across Russia, Kazakhstan and Mongolia, there are peculiar remnants of star-shaped forts and monumental buildings whose design appears oddly modern. These structures, with their geometric precision and layered earthen ramparts, are difficult to attribute to isolated frontier settlements. They suggest a degree of planning and knowledge of engineering not usually associated with nomadic tribes. Of course, mainstream historians caution against seeing too much in these patterns. They argue that the forts belong to European colonial efforts, or that their shapes merely reflect common defensive principles used worldwide. Yet the density of such constructions, often in remote locations, remains puzzling. The debate continues, with some researchers pointing out that many of these sites lack definitive records of when or by whom they were built. Even the very name Tartar adds another layer of ambiguity. It was originally a broad exonym used by Europeans to describe a variety of peoples in Central and Northern Asia, from the Mongols to Turkic tribes. But as centuries passed, the term grew less specific and eventually came to stand for an imagined empire spanning across Siberia. That vagueness could have served as a cover, intentionally or unintentionally, for something more organised that later slipped between the cracks of recorded history. The contradictions grow sharper when one considers European diplomatic references. There are scattered mentions of emissaries from Tartary courts, treaties, and alliances hinted at in correspondence between royal houses. Yet these are rare and often contradictory, leaving historians with a mosaic full of missing tiles. Did Europeans exaggerate their encounters with mysterious Eastern rulers, or did subsequent generations deliberately obscure those connections? Adding to the intrigue is the way certain catastrophic events have been linked to the disappearance of Tartaria. Alternative historians often invoke the so-called mudflood hypothesis, the idea that a massive cataclysm in the 18th or 19th century buried entire cities beneath layers of earth, erasing much of Tartaria's infrastructure. Mainstream science views this claim skeptically, attributing sediment layers to normal geological processes and local floods. Still, the persistence of the mudflood narrative shows how deeply the mystery of Tartaria resonates with the human imagination. Yet not all curiosities are grand in scale. One peculiar anecdote emerges from the journals of a 17th century Dutch merchant who claimed to have encountered in Siberia a mechanical contraption resembling a clock tower, standing alone in a desolate steppe. The account is vague and lacks corroboration, but it has fueled speculation that Tartaria may have preserved technologies out of place for its time. Whether the merchant was exaggerating, misinterpreting, or describing a forgotten artifact remains an open question. The beginning of Tartaria's story, then, is less about certainty than about contradiction. It is about maps that show something no one can prove, travellers who describe things that cannot be verified, and ruins that raise questions without answers. Historians are still debating whether Tartaria was simply a phantom of European imagination, a catch-all for lands beyond understanding, or whether it concealed the shadow of an advanced civilization later swallowed by conquest and catastrophe. The forgotten mapmakers drew boundaries they could not fully explain. In their uncertainty, they left behind a riddle that has only grown sharper with time, and it is within that riddle that the first whispers of Tartaria emerge, an empire of memory, a kingdom of silence, perhaps a civilization erased not by chance but by design. The cartographer's outlines, faint though they were, left behind the impression of an immense landmass governed by something larger than mere nomadic alliances. If Tartaria existed as more than a placeholder, its true shape would have been defined not only by its geography, but by its reach across cultures, languages, and trade. To imagine this empire is to imagine an entity that stretched from the frozen north of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia, brushing against the gates of Persia, the steppes of Mongolia, and even the coasts of the Pacific. It was a space vast enough to swallow half of Eurasia, yet it has all but disappeared from official history. The surviving maps that once bore the word Tartaria depicted it as an umbrella beneath which smaller regions were labelled Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Little Tartary, and even Great Tartary. This suggests that European observers, whether through hearsay or limited contact, believed they were describing subdivisions of a larger whole. Curiously, this mirrored how empires like Rome or the Ottomans were often represented in European atlases, divided into provinces yet united under one overarching name. If these maps reflected at least some truth, then Tartaria was envisioned not as a wilderness, but as a political unit with internal order. Contemporaneous accounts add weight to the possibility. Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century recorded journeys into parts of Central Asia where they claimed to encounter well-structured societies. They described walled cities, administrative centres, and communities that followed a system of governance distinct from both Russian and Chinese authorities. Although modern historians tend to dismiss these records as exaggerations, it is striking that such descriptions appear repeatedly across different sources. The consistency of these reports suggests that Tartaria may have had more coherence than the vague label later implied. The problem, as always, lies in what was not written. Compared to other empires of its supposed scale, Tartaria left behind few surviving chronicles or codices. There are no dynastic annals comparable to those of the Chinese emperors, nor are there marble inscriptions echoing the voices of rulers as in Rome. The silence of Tartaria is almost total, a silence that could be read as absence or as deliberate removal. Scholars are still debating whether this silence is simply the result of fragile records lost to time, or whether subsequent powers may have systematically dismantled the evidence of a rival civilization. The rise of Russia in the 17th and 18th centuries adds to this enigma. As Muscovy expanded eastward, absorbing the khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan and Siberia, it steadily incorporated territories once labelled as Tartary. To the west, the term Little Tartary was used to describe the Crimean Khanate, eventually subdued by Catherine the Great. By the 19th century, the Russian Empire covered nearly all the territory once marked Tartaria. It is possible that, in the process of assimilation, local cultures, languages, and even the memory of Tartaria itself were rewritten under a new identity. Conquest does not merely change borders, it changes the story of who lived there before. There is a precedent for such erasure. The Persian Achaemenid Empire once described lands beyond its control as barbarian, stripping them of complex identity. The Romans did much the same with the tribes they conquered. In both cases, the victor's narrative shaped what future generations believed. Could Tartaria have suffered a similar fate, remembered only through the distorted lens of those who conquered it? The possibility lingers in the historical silence. Trade routes provide another puzzle. The Silk Road, long before its decline, threaded its way across the very regions once called Tartaria. Chinese records speak of caravans passing north of the Altai Mountains, and Persian sources note exchanges in Samarkand and Bukhara. If Tartaria was nothing but empty steppe, how did these trade arteries remain secure? A plausible explanation is that local powers, perhaps loosely organised under the Tartarian banner, maintained the infrastructure and safety of these routes. Yet the details remain hidden, cloaked in absence. There are, however, hints of a cultural footprint. Folklore from Siberian peoples sometimes tells of grand cities swallowed by earth or ice, their inhabitants dispersed into wandering tribes. Whether these tales describe natural disasters or the collapse of larger polities is uncertain, but they carry echoes of a memory older than the societies that tell them today. Archaeologists working in remote Siberian regions have unearthed remains of settlements with surprising levels of planning, stone foundations, heating systems, and artifacts that seem advanced compared to what is usually attributed to nomadic cultures. Mainstream interpretations often assign these remains to local tribal communities, yet alternative theorists see them as shards of Tartaria's forgotten architecture. Even within European records, Tartaria's shadow is hard to ignore. Diplomatic letters between certain monarchs reference Tartar princes or emissaries, though the details are frustratingly sparse. One 16th century letter written in Poland makes mention of an alliance sought with rulers beyond Muscovy, identified vaguely as Tartarian lords. Whether this represented a real sovereign power or simply a misunderstanding of steppe diplomacy is still contested. Historians remain divided, unsure if these mentions indicate true international recognition or merely reflected Europe's limited grasp of Asian geography. Then there are the curious anomalies, star-shaped forts scattered across Eurasia, as if a single architectural blueprint had been applied on a continental scale. Some appear in Russia, others in Kazakhstan, and still more in Mongolia and Siberia. The scale of these constructions raises questions about their origin. Conventional explanations argue that they were built by European powers, often centuries after Tartaria supposedly disappeared. Yet in many cases the official dates of construction remain uncertain, with some ruins appearing older than the empires that claim them. This lack of clarity feeds speculation that they may be remnants of a unified civilization later erased from the record. A particularly strange off-topic anecdote surfaces in 17th century England, where pamphlets circulated describing Tartary as a land of unusual animals and hybrid creatures, reports clearly influenced by travellers' tales and imagination. One account even described a city illuminated by crystalline lamps that shone without fire. While these descriptions belong as much to fantasy as to fact, they hint at how Europeans perceive Tartaria, a place of both wonder and terror, halfway between real geography and mythical otherworld. The empire in the shadows remains difficult to define. Historians are still debating whether Tartaria ever existed as an organised state, or whether it was only an illusion formed by the edges of European knowledge. Yet the persistence of its name, its presence on maps for centuries, and the scattered evidence of settlements, trade, and architecture suggests something more than emptiness. It was not a blank space. It was something that resisted easy definition, something too complex to fit neatly into the categories drawn by European empires. And as Tartaria's shadow lengthens across the centuries, the mystery only deepens. What if an empire once existed there, vast and advanced, its memory extinguished not by chance but by design? The silence that remains may not be emptiness at all, but the echo of a history deliberately forgotten. The story of Tartaria begins to take on sharper edges when one turns away from maps and faded manuscripts and looks instead at the surviving stones and structures scattered across Eurasia. These remnants, often overlooked or dismissed as mundane, tell a tale of architecture that seems far too advanced, too precise, and too widespread to belong solely to the local histories under which they are now classified. If Tartaria truly existed as a civilization of great scope, its clearest legacy may not be in written words at all, but in the very geometry of its constructions. Across Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe, a curious pattern emerges: the recurrence of star-shaped forts. These massive bastions, designed in striking radial symmetry, with walls that fan out like the points of a celestial body, seem to belong to a different order of planning. Star forts are well documented in European history, particularly from the Renaissance onwards, as defensive structures that could withstand cannon fire. Yet dozens of examples in Russia, Kazakhstan, and even Mongolia remain enigmas. Some are attributed to Imperial Russia, but others appear in places too remote, with dates of construction left vague or inconsistent. The question lingers: were these fortresses truly the work of European expansion, or do they represent an architectural inheritance from something older, perhaps a network of cities united under a forgotten empire? The debate is ongoing. Mainstream historians insist that these forts can be explained within the context of Russian military engineering imported from the West during the 17th and 18th centuries. But alternative researchers argue that their sheer number, often aligned with trade routes or natural resource deposits, suggests a deeper origin. Some have even suggested they were not merely military installations, but part of a broader system, cities built with geomantic precision, perhaps to harness natural energy flows. Such hypotheses stretch beyond accepted scholarship, but they highlight the lingering unease in attributing all of these constructions to a single narrow explanation. Architecture attributed to Tartaria is not limited to forts. In Siberia and Central Asia, monumental buildings emerge that appear strangely out of step with their surroundings. Ornate facades, grand columns, and domes reminiscent of neoclassical design rise in places where one would expect only wooden houses or yurts. Many of these structures are today explained as products of the Russian Empire or later Soviet reconstruction. Yet questions remain about their origins. Local traditions sometimes speak of older buildings repurposed by incoming powers, as if Imperial Russia found cities already standing and simply rebranded them. Historians are still debating whether these oral traditions contain kernels of truth, or merely reflect nostalgia for a lost past. The so-called mudflood hypothesis intertwines itself with these architectural mysteries. Advocates of this controversial theory point to buildings with windows buried below street level, doors that open to soil instead of air, and entire lower stories concealed beneath accumulated earth. Conventional explanations attribute these anomalies to gradual urban development, the raising of streets, the accumulation of sediment, or reconstruction after floods. Yet to those seeking Tartaria's traces, such evidence suggests that a catastrophic deluge of mud and silt once swept across Eurasian cities, burying the lower halves of structures that belong to a forgotten age. If true, this would not only explain the oddities of architecture, but also provide a mechanism for how Tartaria's cities vanish so quickly from memory. Strange details compound the mystery. Travellers' accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally describe large stone buildings in Siberian settlements where no such construction should have existed, given the limitations of local resources and technology. One French envoy wrote of a grand administrative hall in Tobolsk with vaulted ceilings and intricate stonework, features he claimed rivaled those of European capitals. If his description was accurate, where did such architectural skill originate in a land often dismissed as peripheral? Was it the work of imported European artisans, or was it evidence of a tradition already rooted there before Russia's advance? Hypotheses proliferate in the absence of certainty. Some suggest that Tartaria mastered techniques of construction that have since been lost: advanced masonry, durable mortars, or even the capacity to shape stone with unusual precision. Others propose that these cities were designed not just for habitation but for resonance, their proportions echoing cosmic principles and natural harmonics. Such claims may verge into speculation, yet they reveal how architecture can serve as a vessel for memory even when texts are gone. There are also oddities that resist explanation altogether. In remote regions of Kazakhstan, archaeologists have discovered geometric earthworks visible only from above. Massive patterns carved into the landscape, including crosses, circles, and radial designs. Mainstream research suggests these may be prehistoric ceremonial sites, but to those who argue for Tartaria, they appear as yet another layer of advanced spatial awareness, perhaps aligned to celestial movements or territorial markers of a forgotten empire. Their age remains contested, and scholars are still debating whether they are thousands of years old or much younger. A peculiar off-topic event only deepens the sense of mystery. In the early 19th century, a Russian official reportedly commissioned the dismantling of a massive stone structure in Irkutsk, describing it in his notes as a building whose purpose and origin none could tell. The materials were repurposed for other construction projects, leaving little behind. The act itself is not unusual. Empires often recycled stone, but the absence of any clear record about the building's design or function feeds speculation that it may have been a Tartarian relic quietly erased from the landscape. Even the aesthetic language of these structures adds to the puzzle. Many bear features resembling neoclassical styles centuries before such architecture was widespread in Russia. Could this mean that the builders of Tartaria anticipated or even influenced later European tastes? Or does it simply reflect the universal appeal of symmetry, arches and domes in architecture across cultures? Historians remain divided, and the debate shows no sign of resolution. What emerges, then, is a portrait of architects whose works appear too deliberate, too refined, and too numerous to have been accidents or isolated anomalies. The buildings themselves stand as mute witnesses, stripped of context yet still whispering of an order long gone. If Tartaria existed, perhaps its most enduring legacy lies in these impossible structures, works that do not quite fit the timelines assigned to them, constructions that feel out of place, and ruins that seem to belong to another narrative altogether. The question that follows naturally is this: if such cities and monuments existed, what became of them? How does an empire leave behind stone walls yet vanish from the chronicles that should preserve its name? The answer, some believe, lies in Catastrophe. a great reset that silenced the voices of Tartaria and buried its cities under earth and mud. If the remnants of architecture hint at a civilization too advanced to vanish quietly, then the next question must be, what force could possibly sweep an entire empire from the map, leaving only fragments of stone and whispers in cartographic margins? For many who believe in Tartaria's existence, the answer is not a slow decline, but a sudden cataclysmic event, what has come to be called the Great Reset hypothesis. It is a theory that combines elements of natural disaster, political conquest, and deliberate historical erasure, suggesting that Tartaria was not merely forgotten, but was systematically buried, both physically and narratively. Central to this hypothesis is the so-called mudflood theory. Across Eurasia, in cities from St. Petersburg to Omsk, from Kazan to Kiev, there are buildings whose lower levels are mysteriously underground. Windows peek out from beneath street level, doorways open into earth, and entire floors appear swallowed by soil. Mainstream explanations attribute these anomalies to the gradual raising of streets over centuries, uneven subsidence, or repeated flooding events that deposited sediment. Yet alternative researchers argue that the scale of these anomalies, spread over thousands of kilometers, points to something much larger, a sudden wave of mud, silt, and water that engulfed entire urban landscapes in a relatively short time. The hypothesis proposes that sometime between the 17th and 19th centuries, a vast environmental upheaval occurred, perhaps triggered by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or even shifts in the polar regions. This disaster sent torrents of liquefied earth across Eurasia, burying the first floors of cities and wiping out large populations. Those who survived, it is argued, repurposed the half-buried structures, adding new stories above ground level, leaving the buried remnants as mute evidence of catastrophe. If Tartaria truly stood as a great empire, such a cataclysm could explain why its urban centres vanished, their histories drowned in soil. Historians remain deeply sceptical. There is little geological evidence to suggest such a continent-spanning mudflood in recent centuries. Sediment layers that appear unusual are usually explained through local causes, river floods, landslides, or long-term urban development. Yet the visual evidence persists, and with it the unease that perhaps something more dramatic occurred than conventional history admits. Scholars are still debating whether these anomalies reflect natural processes, or whether they are artifacts of selective interpretation, seen only through the lens of alternative history. The Great Reset hypothesis extends beyond geology. It also proposes that the mudflood was only part of a larger pattern of destruction and suppression. In this view, conquering empires, particularly Russia and to a lesser extent China and European colonial powers, seized the opportunity to erase Tartaria from the record. They rebuilt over its ruins, claimed its architecture as their own, and rewrote maps to exclude its name. By the 19th century, Tartaria had been divided into a patchwork of Russian provinces, Central Asian khanates, and Siberian territories, each with new identities. The empire itself had vanished, not only beneath mud but beneath paper. Evidence for such deliberate erasure is difficult to prove, yet anomalies persist. Old encyclopedias from the 18th century describe Tartary as a major empire, but by the late 19th century, newer editions scarcely mention it. Travelogues from earlier centuries describe encounters with Tartarian lords, but later historians dismiss them as errors. How could a name once so widespread vanish almost entirely in the span of a few generations? The silence is striking, and to some suspicious. One hypothesis suggests that the Great Reset was not solely a natural event, but may have involved technological forces lost to time. Fringe researchers point to ancient accounts of fires in the sky, unexplained explosions, or storms of unprecedented scale. They speculate, without solid evidence, that Tartaria may have harnessed technologies that backfired catastrophically, leading to its own downfall. Such ideas remain on the edges of scholarship, but they reveal the enduring human impulse to seek hidden causes when visible explanations seem inadequate. An odd event recorded in Siberia illustrates this ambiguity. In 1908, the Tunguska explosion leveled thousands of square kilometers of forest, flattening trees in a radial pattern. Mainstream science attributes it to a meteor airburst, yet some alternative thinkers suggest it may have been a remnant echo of older forces, perhaps linked to the same energies that destroyed Tartaria centuries earlier. While there is no direct connection, the coincidence of such an immense localized disaster on the edge of Tartaria's former map adds fuel to speculation that sudden cataclysms may be woven into the land's memory. Historical precedents elsewhere remind us that civilizations can indeed vanish quickly. The eruption of Thera in the Aegean may have destroyed the Minoans. The sudden collapse of the Indus Valley civilization left cities abandoned. Even Rome, though not obliterated by a single disaster, fell with astonishing speed once its foundations weakened. Could Tartaria have suffered a similar fate, its fall accelerated by both catastrophe and conquest? The pattern is not impossible. The Great Reset hypothesis also ties into stories of global expositions in the 19th century. Some argue that the grand buildings erected for world fairs, immense domes, sprawling exhibition halls and intricate pavilions, were not constructed in a few short years as officially claimed, but rather were remnants of Tartarian architecture repurposed for new displays. These buildings, some of which were later demolished with suspicious haste, are viewed as evidence of a hidden inheritance disguised as temporary construction. Historians explain these fairs as feats of industrial engineering and rapid design, but the scale of the work continues to inspire suspicion among those who see Tartaria's shadow. Even if the mudflood never happened as described, the theory reflects a deeper unease, that our understanding of history may be less secure than we believe, that entire civilizations could be erased, not gradually through centuries, but suddenly, violently, and almost completely. And if Tartaria was truly destroyed by a reset, then what we know of the modern world may rest upon ruins we have not yet recognized. The architects of the impossible built structures that defy easy explanation. But the Great Reset hypothesis suggests that their cities were drowned in mud, their stories buried in silence, and their memory rewritten by others. Whether through natural disaster, technological accident, or deliberate erasure, Tartaria's disappearance seems less like a slow fading and more like a sudden extinguishing. The next question, then, is whether there were signs of technological brilliance that survived the flood and the conquest, fragments of mechanical wonders that hint at what Tartaria may have once achieved. The ruins of walls and forts hint at power, but architecture alone does not capture the full weight of a civilization's ingenuity. If Tartaria was more than an empty name on a map, then evidence of its brilliance might also lie in the whispers of technology, machines, mechanisms and devices that seem to have belonged to another age. Scattered reports from travellers, fragments of oral tradition, and odd relics tucked away in museums suggest that Tartaria may once have possessed mechanical wonders whose sophistication outpaced their time. One of the most persistent themes in these accounts is energy. In the 19th century, many European observers remarked upon the unusual spires and domes of buildings in Russian and Central Asian cities. While officially described as stylistic or religious, some alternative researchers propose they may have served functional purposes, possibly as conduits for atmospheric electricity. The resemblance of these towers to later experiments with electromagnetic transmission has drawn comparisons to the work of Nikola Tesla. Although mainstream historians dismiss such parallels as anachronistic, the idea that Tartaria might have harnessed forms of energy long before the modern era continues to intrigue. In Siberia, there are legends of self-moving carts and sledges that required no horses. Local stories describe iron chariots that glided silently across the steppe, guided by unseen forces. These tales are usually interpreted as folklore, metaphors for swift travel, or mythologized memories of trade caravans. Yet the consistency with which they appear in different regions suggests that they may preserve a distorted memory of real mechanical contraptions. Could Tartaria have developed primitive forms of rail or magnet-driven vehicles, later lost during its erasure? Historians are still debating whether such stories represent distorted recollections of contact with foreign technology or genuine hints of forgotten innovation. Accounts from European travellers occasionally mention devices out of place for the time. A Dutch merchant in the 17th century wrote of encountering a water-lifting mechanism in a Tartarian settlement that appeared to operate without visible gears or manual labour, as though driven by pressure or natural currents. Another Jesuit report spoke vaguely of machines of heat, used for bathing in Central Asia, though this could have referred simply to advanced bathhouses. Still, the ambiguity leaves room for speculation that Tartaria may have experimented with forms of energy or engineering unfamiliar to its neighbours. Even more intriguing are the references to sound and resonance. In certain folk songs from the Altai region, there are descriptions of great singing stones that could amplify voices or produce tones when struck. Alternative theorists connect these to the possibility of Tartaria using acoustic resonance in construction, buildings and monuments designed to channel vibration, perhaps even as part of their power systems. While such claims lack solid evidence, they reflect a broader human fascination with the idea that ancient civilizations might have accessed subtle forces now overlooked. There are also peculiar objects that fuel the debate. In scattered collections across Russia and Central Asia, there exist odd metallic artifacts whose function is unclear. Some resemble gears or fittings, others appear as hollow spheres with inscriptions or geometric patterns. Most are likely fragments of industrial machinery from the 18th or 19th century, yet enthusiasts point to them as possible remnants of Tartarian devices. One object in particular, a small, intricate bronze fitting discovered in Siberia, has been compared, without definitive proof, to the Antikythera mechanism of Greece. Could Tartaria have produced its own precision instruments, now scattered and mislabeled in museums? Adding to the puzzle is the widespread fascination with pneumatic systems in the 18th century. European engineers experimented with air-powered devices, vacuum chambers, and atmospheric pumps. Curiously, descriptions of Tartarian cities occasionally mention networks of underground tunnels or conduits whose purposes are not fully explained. Were these simply sewage systems, or could they have been part of a broader infrastructure that channeled air, water, or even energy across urban centres? Hypotheses vary, and historians remain divided. A strange off-topic event occurred in the early 20th century, when workers excavating in Irkutsk uncovered a large metal cylinder buried beneath layers of soil. The object, corroded and partly destroyed, was reported in local newspapers as an ancient boiler of unusual design. It was later melted down during wartime shortages, leaving only written descriptions. Some have speculated it could have been part of an early steam mechanism, or perhaps something stranger, tied to the lost mechanical heritage of Tartaria. Whether coincidence or evidence, it remains one of many small mysteries swallowed by time. The persistence of these mechanical legends recalls other forgotten technologies. The steam engines of Hero of Alexandria vanished for centuries before similar devices reappeared in the modern age. The Baghdad battery, whose purpose is still debated, suggests that experiments with electricity occurred in antiquity. If Tartaria did exist as a civilization, it is conceivable that it too possessed technologies whose purpose we no longer understand. The absence of written explanation does not prove absence of achievement. There is, however, a danger in over-romanticizing. For every anecdote of unusual devices, there are countless simpler explanations. A self-moving cart could have been a sled pushed by wind, a water-lifting mechanism could have been an Archimedean screw, and metallic fragments could belong to later industrial projects. Yet the fact that these objects and stories align with the idea of Tartaria keeps them alive in cultural memory. Historians are still debating whether these accounts are evidence of something extraordinary or merely the exaggerations of travellers seeking wonder in unfamiliar lands. The fascination with Tartaria's mechanical wonders persists because it challenges assumptions about linear progress. If advanced devices once existed and were later lost, then the story of human technology is not one of steady ascent but of cycles, knowledge gained, forgotten, and rediscovered. Tartaria, whether real or imagined, embodies the possibility that civilizations can rise to great heights of ingenuity, only to vanish without leaving a trace of their machines. The ruins may whisper of architecture, and the mudflood may hint at catastrophe, but the stories of machines add another layer. The idea that Tartaria once moved not only stone and brick, but also gears and levers, harnessing forces that would not be understood again for centuries. If true, then its erasure is even more profound, for it means humanity may have lost not just a culture, but a chapter of invention itself. The next piece of the puzzle lies not in machines, but in people. For even if cities were buried and devices forgotten, there were still those who claimed to have seen Tartaria with their own eyes. Emissaries, merchants, and explorers who left behind fragments of testimony. The written record of Tartaria is elusive, but it is not entirely silent. Scattered among the archives of Europe and Asia are reports of travellers, merchants, and emissaries who claimed in one way or another to have crossed paths with the mysterious Northern Empire. These accounts are fragmented, often contradictory, and sometimes written with the embellishments of men who knew their readers hungered for tales of wonder. Yet within the fragments are glimpses of a civilization that seems too complex to be dismissed outright. One of the earliest descriptions comes from 16th century European travellers who ventured east beyond Muscovy. Some noted with curiosity that Muscovite rulers spoke of Tartaria as if it were a formidable neighbour, a land with its own lords and courts, with whom diplomacy was sometimes required and sometimes avoided. These references suggest that Tartaria was not merely an empty wilderness in the minds of contemporaries, but a power whose existence shaped decisions in Moscow. Historians are still debating whether these references were exaggerations of nomadic alliances or hints of something more structured, perhaps even a federation of states hidden behind the steppe. Jesuit missionaries also provide glimpses. Letters sent back to Europe in the 17th century describe communities in Central Asia with walled towns, administrative centres, and a degree of order unfamiliar to the nomadic stereotype. They wrote of encounters with rulers who received them formally, offering gifts and hospitality in manners similar to established courts. These accounts, though brief and often framed through the lens of Christian mission, suggest that parts of Tartaria maintained organised governance. The Jesuits, skilled observers accustomed to recognising authority, would not easily mistake a tribal chieftain for the ruler of a state. Trade records add another layer of intrigue. Persian and Ottoman sources occasionally mention envoys or merchants travelling northward to lands they identified as Tartary. One Persian chronicler in the 17th century described a caravan route that terminated in a city of towers beyond the Kazakh steppe. The chronicler never named the city, and the manuscript later fell into obscurity, but its imagery lingers. A city of towers where maps otherwise show only empty plains. Was this a memory of Samarkand misattributed to Tartaria, or did it reflect knowledge of a settlement now vanished? Scholars remain divided, and the lack of further corroboration leaves the question unresolved. Diplomatic correspondence in Europe adds to the ambiguity. In the early 18th century, Polish and Swedish records occasionally mention emissaries from Tartar princes seeking alliances during times of conflict with Russia. Whether these emissaries truly represented a sovereign Tartaria or were merely local khanates using the name is unclear. Yet the fact that such figures were taken seriously enough to warrant negotiation indicates that the idea of Tartarian rulers persisted in the diplomatic imagination well into the modern era. The reports are not always flattering. Some describe the Tartars as fierce warriors, unpredictable in their alliances, and skilled in horsemanship beyond comparison. Others depict them as shrewd traders, moving goods between Russia, Persia, and China. A few accounts even suggest that Tartarian rulers controlled key segments of the Silk Road, exacting tolls from passing caravans. If true, this would imply not only military strength but economic control, two pillars of any functioning state. And yet, the official chronicles of Russia and China remain curiously quiet about Tartaria as a unified entity. Russian records speak of conquests over various khanates, but rarely mention Tartaria as a whole. Chinese annals describe northern nomads but not an empire of Tartars. This discrepancy raises the possibility that Tartaria was an identity used primarily in the West, a way of naming a space that Eastern powers preferred to divide into smaller, more manageable parts. Still, the absence of a unified record does not prove absence of a unified reality. It may instead point to deliberate avoidance, a refusal to acknowledge an empire that did not fit the categories of imperial neighbours. An odd anecdote arises from the 17th century, when an English traveller recorded in his journal that he had been shown a Tartarian automaton, a mechanical bird that could flap its wings and sing when wound with a key. The device was said to have been gifted by a local ruler as a sign of hospitality. Whether this was a genuine mechanical invention, a cleverly disguised toy, or an embellishment of the traveller's imagination, it adds a strange technological flavour to the image of Tartaria. Machines, architecture and empire all converge in these scattered fragments, hinting at a culture not so easily dismissed. There are also reports of religion and ceremony. A German traveller described a festival in which Tartarian priests burned incense before large stone idols, though his description is vague and coloured by Christian disapproval. Another account speaks of vast gatherings on the steppe, where thousands assembled in orderly rows to hear proclamations from mounted leaders. Whether these events reflected shamanic rituals, Islamic practices, or something distinct to Tartaria is unclear. Scholars are still debating whether such references were accurate observations or projections of European fears onto the unknown. If one steps back, the pattern becomes visible. Tartaria appears again and again in the margins of history, never fully described but never entirely absent. It is present in trade, in diplomacy, in travelogues, and in rumour. It is large enough to matter, yet elusive enough to vanish. Such qualities make it difficult to pin down and easy to erase. But why did these encounters leave so little trace? Perhaps because the empires that absorbed Tartaria had no interest in preserving its memory. For Russia, it was more useful to speak of conquered khanates than of a lost empire. For China, it was simpler to describe nomads rather than rivals. For Europe, it was convenient to let the label fade once its political usefulness had passed. The scattered emissaries and merchants who described Tartaria were then left as lonely voices, drowned out by the louder narratives of empires that survived. Yet their testimony still matters, for within their contradictions, exaggerations and silences lies the possibility that they saw a shadow of something larger. If Tartaria existed, then these imperial encounters are among the last footprints of its presence, stamped lightly upon the records of others. The question then becomes, what happened when Tartaria collided directly with the rising power of Russia? And what role did the Tsars play in absorbing, silencing, or perhaps deliberately dismantling the traces of their enigmatic neighbour? As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the Russian Empire advanced steadily eastward. What began as the expansion of Muscovy into nearby lands became a relentless march across Siberia, swallowing forests, rivers and peoples as it moved toward the Pacific. It was during this period of growth that the shadow of Tartaria seems to have receded most dramatically, as if crushed beneath the boots of advancing armies and the pens of bureaucrats. If Tartaria existed as an organised civilization, then its fate was intimately tied to Russia's rise, and its erasure may have been one of the great power struggles of the early modern world. The Russian conquest of Kazan in 1552 and Astrakhan in 1556 marked turning points. These khanates, often included under the umbrella of Tartary in European maps, were subdued and incorporated into the growing Tsardom. With their fall, Muscovy gained not only territory, but symbolic dominance over lands long associated with the steppe. The conquest of Siberia followed soon after, with Cossack expeditions pushing into vast, scarcely mapped territories. By the early 17th century, forts dotted the rivers Ob, Yenisei and Lena, each one a foothold in the dismantling of what cartographers still called Tartaria. Historians today argue that Russia's conquest was primarily against fragmented khanates and nomadic tribes, rather than a centralized empire. Yet some records hint otherwise. In 1630, a Muscovite official referred in correspondence to Tartar kings who resist our rule. Whether he meant local chieftains or rulers of a broader polity is unclear, but the phrasing suggests a recognition of authority beyond mere tribal leadership. The ambiguity deepens the mystery. Was Russia consciously dismantling a larger power, or merely rebranding smaller polities under one imperial narrative? As Russia grew, so too did its need to legitimize its rule. One effective method was rewriting the history of the conquered. Chronicles produced in Moscow emphasized the barbarity of the Tartars, portraying them as wild nomads whose lands required Russian order. Such depictions justified expansion while erasing any possibility that Tartaria had been a sophisticated rival. Historians are still debating whether this portrayal was deliberate propaganda or simply the limited understanding of Muscovite scribes. Yet the effect was the same. Tartaria faded from recognition, replaced by the Russian narrative of conquest. Cartography followed suit. By the mid-18th century, Russian-sponsored maps began to show Siberia and Central Asia in finer detail. Where once Great Tartary had sprawled across the page, now there were provinces, rivers and towns, all bearing Russian names. The transformation of geography into bureaucracy was nearly complete. What had once been an empire in shadow was now absorbed into the neat lines of imperial administration. The process was not purely military. Cultural assimilation played its role. Russian Orthodox missions expanded eastward, converting local populations and erasing older spiritual practices. Settlers followed, bringing with them architecture, language, and laws. In time, the memory of Tartaria, if it existed as a cultural identity, became diluted, absorbed into a new Russian identity imposed from above. The survival of fragments in folklore and architecture may hint at resistance, but the larger story was one of systematic replacement. Oddly, some Russian records preserve traces of Tartaria even as they sought to erase it. In 18th century census documents, categories such as Tartar or Tartarian appear, applied to populations living across vast stretches of Siberia. These categories blur ethnicity, culture and geography, reducing diverse peoples to a single vague label. The very vagueness of the classification suggests that the Russian state recognized a broader identity, but chose not to define it clearly. Whether this was administrative convenience or intentional obfuscation remains an open question. An unusual off-topic event adds colour to this period. In 1722, during Peter the Great's campaign in the Caspian region, his forces reported finding a ruined stone fortress with inscriptions they could not read. The stones were hauled away and repurposed for Russian construction, and no trace of the inscriptions remains. Whether these ruins were genuinely ancient or simply misidentified is unknown. Yet the incident illustrates how conquest often destroyed as much as it recorded, leaving gaps that later fuel speculation about what was lost. The absorption of Tartaria into Russia also raises the question of timing. Why did Tartaria disappear from European maps so quickly after Russia's expansion? Some argue that it was merely the result of improved knowledge. As Europeans gained better access to Siberia through Russian sources, the vague label of Tartaria was no longer needed. Others, however, suspect deliberate suppression, a rewriting of maps to erase the memory of a rival empire. Historians are still debating whether the shift was innocent or intentional, but the coincidence of timing remains striking. The Tsars themselves had much to gain from such erasure. Claiming Tartaria as wilderness legitimized Russian conquest as a civilizing mission. Admitting that a rival empire once stood in those lands would have undermined the narrative of rightful expansion. Thus, whether through silence, distortion, or omission, Tartaria's identity was subsumed into that of Russia. By the 19th century, Tartaria was a ghost. It lingered in the names of certain ethnic groups, in the titles of maps, and in the imaginations of travellers, but as an empire it was gone. Russia had triumphed, and in its triumph the traces of Tartaria were buried beneath new cities, new institutions, and new stories. And yet, questions remain. Was Tartaria nothing more than a loose collection of Khanates swallowed by a rising power, or was it a civilization erased by conquest and deliberate historical revision? The truth is unclear, but what is clear is that as Tartaria faded, another empire's shadow grew, the Mongols, and it is within their legacy that many still search for echoes of the erased civilization. The enigma of Tartaria grows even more tangled when considered alongside the Mongol Empire. For centuries, European maps often overlapped the two, placing Tartaria in regions once dominated by Genghis Khan and his successors. To some historians, this overlap explains everything. Tartaria was never a separate civilization at all, but merely the Western label for lands once ruled by Mongols. Yet others argue the resemblance is only partial, and that the persistence of the name Tartaria, centuries after the Mongol Empire's collapse, suggests something distinct, something that cannot be explained away so easily. The Mongol Empire of the 13th and 14th centuries was vast, stretching from China to Hungary, from Siberia to Persia. Its administrative centres, such as Karakorum and later Khanbalik, Beijing, commanded immense networks of tribute and trade. European chroniclers, encountering Mongol envoys or hearing second-hand stories, often used the term Tartar to describe them. The word itself was a corruption of Tatar, one of the steppe tribes allied under Genghis Khan, but over time it came to encompass all Mongol peoples in the European imagination. By the time Renaissance cartographers began marking Great Tartary on their maps, the association between Mongols and Tartars was deeply embedded in Western thought. Yet the Mongol Empire collapsed by the late 14th century, fracturing into smaller Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and others. By the 17th century, only a few remnants remained, such as the Crimean Khanate and the Dzungar Khanate in Central Asia. And still, maps of that period continue to label much of Northern Asia as Tartaria, a name implying unity where fragmentation reigned. Why did European cartographers persist in using this label centuries after the Mongol Empire had ceased to exist? Historians are still debating whether it was due to ignorance, inertia, or the persistence of a reality hidden from mainstream accounts. Supporters of the Tartaria hypothesis argue that the survival of the name hints at continuity. They suggest that while the Mongols faded, another polity, perhaps Tartaria itself, maintained authority in those regions, inheriting infrastructure, military tactics, and trade routes. This would explain why European travellers continued to describe organised rulers and fortified cities well into the 17th century, long after the Mongol collapse. If so, Tartaria may have been less a rival of the Mongols than a successor, absorbing their structures while building something new. There are cultural echoes as well. Certain architectural styles in Siberia and Central Asia bear little resemblance to Chinese or Russian forms, but show parallels to Mongol administrative centres. Large square courtyards, centralised halls, and monumental gateways suggest a lingering tradition of imperial planning. Alternative theorists see in these ruins the fingerprints of a Tartarian state that carried forward Mongol legacies while developing its own distinctive identity. Conventional scholarship attributes them to local variations or later Russian influence, but the resemblance remains striking. Linguistic traces complicate the picture further. The word Tartar became so entrenched in European languages that it shaped perceptions of entire peoples. In Russian usage, Tatar came to describe numerous ethnic groups, from the Volga Tatars to the Crimean Tatars, regardless of their precise heritage. This blanket term obscured the possibility of a larger unifying identity. Yet folk traditions among some of these groups tell of ancestors who once belonged to a great northern empire now forgotten. Whether these oral histories preserve memories of the Mongols, of Tartaria, or of something else entirely is difficult to determine. One strange episode illustrates the ambiguity. In 1692, French missionaries in Beijing reported being introduced to an ambassador from the King of Tartary. The ambassador's credentials were presented formally at the Qing court, suggesting legitimacy. Historians now suspect he may have represented the Dzunga Khanate, but the Europeans recorded him under the name Tartary, as though recognizing an empire still alive in their imagination. Was this merely a linguistic misunderstanding, or a glimpse of a polity that consciously claimed the title of Tartaria? Scholars remain divided, uncertain whether the name was a convenient label or an intentional assertion of sovereignty. There are also curiosities in heraldry. Certain coats of arms used in European treatises depict a crowned figure labelled as Rex Tartarorum, King of the Tartars. These images appear alongside depictions of other monarchs, implying recognition, even if symbolic, of Tartaria as a legitimate realm. Whether these representations reflected actual rulers or were artistic conventions is uncertain. Still, their presence hints at a place for Tartaria in the mental map of European elites. Alternative historians sometimes go further, proposing that Tartaria was not merely a successor to the Mongols, but a rival contemporary power deliberately conflated with them. According to this hypothesis, the Mongol invasions served as a convenient cover for Tartarian expansion, or perhaps both empires coexisted, their histories entangled but not identical. The lack of precise records leaves the field open to such speculation, though mainstream historians find little concrete evidence to support it. A peculiar off-topic detail comes from a 17th century German travelogue describing the steppes of Central Asia. The author claimed to have seen enormous stone statues of mounted warriors, lined in rows as though guarding invisible cities. These statues, he said, bore inscriptions in a script he could not read. Modern archaeologists know of Turkic stone, steles scattered across the steppe, often dedicated to ancestors or heroes, but the traveller's description suggests a scale grander than usual. If accurate, could these monuments have been remnants of Tartarian commemoration, blending Mongol traditions with a broader imperial identity? The echoes of the Mongols remain powerful because they provide both a plausible explanation and a tantalizing question. On one hand, Tartaria could simply have been the residue of Mongol memory, a European mislabeling that persisted long after the empire's fall. On the other, the survival of the name, the scattered reports of rulers, and the remnants of architecture may point to something more, a civilization distinct from, yet shaped by, the Mongols. Historians are still debating where the boundary lies, and perhaps it will never be settled. If Tartaria was indeed more than a shadow of the Mongols, then its uniqueness may be preserved in other ways, through the languages spoken by its peoples, through scripts and dialects now suppressed, and through linguistic anomalies that hint at an identity once erased. Among the many ways civilizations leave their imprint, language is perhaps the most enduring. Empires rise and fall, cities are built and buried, but words linger, shifting slowly over centuries, carrying traces of forgotten peoples. If Tartaria once stood as a true civilization, then fragments of its existence might survive not in monuments or maps, but in syllables, scripts, and the faint outlines of dialects. The mystery of Tartarian language is one of the most elusive, for while no complete written record survives under that name, echoes may still resound in the voices of those who came after. The very word Tartar already reveals the confusion. Europeans adopted it in the Middle Ages, likely from the Turkic word Tatar, used to describe certain steppe tribes allied under the Mongols. But in European tongues, Tartar also carried connotations of hellfire, derived from the Greek Tartarus, the underworld. Thus, even in its earliest use, the word was entangled with both ethnography and myth. This linguistic ambiguity may have obscured a more precise identity. Historians are still debating whether the broad application of Tartar was an innocent error of translation or a deliberate way to flatten diverse peoples into a single exotic label. Linguistic traces across Siberia and Central Asia reveal tantalizing anomalies. The Volga Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, and the Siberian Tatars all speak Turkic languages today, yet within their dialects are archaic forms and loanwords not easily traced to Turkic, Mongolic, or Slavic roots. Some linguists have suggested these anomalies reflect older substrate languages now extinct, remnants perhaps of a wider linguistic landscape erased by assimilation. If Tartaria existed as a unifying force, it may have fostered a lingua franca that later dissolved into the tongues of conquered peoples. There are also scattered references to scripts that no longer exist. A 17th century Polish chronicle describes a manuscript written in the letters of Tartaria, though the document itself has vanished. Another account from a Jesuit traveller in China mentions encountering characters strange to both Chinese and Mongol, used in inscriptions on a ruined structure in Central Asia. Could these have been misinterpretations of Turkic runes or local alphabets? Possibly, but they raise the tantalizing possibility that Tartaria possessed its own written system, now lost or deliberately destroyed. Scholars remain cautious, yet the absence of even fragments fuels speculation about suppression. Folklore sometimes preserves what paper does not. Among the Yakuts of Siberia, epic poems known as Olonko describe ancestral lands ruled by powerful leaders, where stone cities stood before they were swallowed by earth. These oral traditions, passed down for generations, include words and names that linguists cannot fully explain. They hint at an older stratum of language, one that might belong to a culture predating Russian domination. Whether these fragments connect to Tartaria or represent an entirely different lost culture is unclear, but they add another layer of mystery to the linguistic landscape. Odd connections also emerge in European sources. In a 17th century Latin dictionary, one finds the term lingua tartarica, listed alongside entries for Turkish and Mongolic. The brief description implies a distinct language, not merely a dialect, but no vocabulary is provided. Was this an error by the compiler, or evidence that travellers once believed in the existence of a Tartarian tongue? Historians are still debating whether such entries were careless repetitions of rumour or genuine, if fleeting, acknowledgements of linguistic diversity. An unusual anecdote comes from the 19th century, when Russian archaeologists excavating near Tomsk reported finding inscribed clay tablets with markings they could not decipher. The artifacts were sent to St. Petersburg but were lost during the upheavals of war. Some claimed the inscriptions resembled cuneiform, while others argued they were simply scratches made by nature. The story has never been verified, but in the world of Tartarian speculation, such fragments are treated as possible remnants of a suppressed script. Language also intersects with power. As Russia expanded, it imposed Cyrillic on many of the peoples it absorbed, replacing local scripts and dialects. The suppression of indigenous languages is well documented, and in some cases entire written traditions disappeared within a few generations. It is not inconceivable that if Tartaria had a language of its own, it could have been systematically erased during this process, overwritten by Russian orthography. The silence of surviving records may reflect not absence, but erasure. Even in religious texts, traces appear. Some early Islamic manuscripts from Central Asia mention the tongue of the northern lords, described as distinct from both Turkic and Persian. Whether this phrase referred to a specific Tartarian language or was simply poetic exaggeration is uncertain. Still, it suggests that outsiders perceived linguistic diversity in the region, even if they could not categorize it. A peculiar off-topic event highlights the fragility of linguistic evidence. In 1907, a collector in Paris displayed a book he claimed to be written in Tartarian characters, obtained from a trader in Central Asia. The script was ornate, with looping symbols unfamiliar to scholars of the time. Within a few years, the book vanished, leaving only a brief description in a catalogue. Some believe it was a forgery, crafted to attract attention in an era fascinated by the exotic. Others wonder if it was a genuine relic, swallowed by private collections and lost to history. If Tartaria's language once existed, its disappearance would not be unique. Entire linguistic families have vanished before: the Etruscan tongue of Italy, the linear script of Minoan Crete, and countless indigenous languages silenced by colonization. Each loss leaves behind traces, loanwords, inscriptions, echoes in later dialects, but the core is gone. Tartaria's silence may belong to this long tradition of forgotten voices. What remains then are anomalies, words without roots, inscriptions without translations, and oral traditions that hint at a deeper past. They do not prove the existence of a Tartarian language, but they keep the possibility alive. Historians are still debating whether these fragments are enough to reconstruct anything meaningful, or whether Tartaria's voice has been silenced forever. Yet even if the language has vanished, another form of evidence remains: the maps that once labelled these lands. For centuries, Tartaria was inscribed across atlases, only to vanish just as suddenly. If language is one measure of identity, cartography is another, and the disappearance of Tartaria from maps may be the clearest sign of deliberate erasure. Maps are more than guides to geography. They are instruments of memory, political tools, and mirrors of how civilizations perceive the world. To trace Tartaria's presence through cartography is to watch a shadow empire come into view and then vanish, almost as though erased by unseen hands. For centuries, atlases across Europe confidently labelled vast regions as Tartaria. Then, within little more than a century, the word disappeared, replaced by the borders of expanding empires. This sudden absence is one of the strongest pieces of evidence fueling the suspicion that Tartaria was not merely forgotten, but deliberately suppressed. In the 16th century, renowned mapmakers such as Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius included Great Tartary in their atlases. The names stretched across Siberia and Central Asia, sometimes divided into Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Little Tartary. These subdivisions suggest that cartographers believed they were describing a coherent entity with internal distinctions, much like the provinces of known empires. To their European audiences, Tartaria was no obscure rumour, but a recognisable feature of the world. Atlases placed it prominently, indicating its importance in the geography of the time. 17th century maps continued the trend. French and Dutch mapmakers, meticulous in their detail, carefully inscribed Tartaria across immense spaces. In many editions, it occupied more visual space than the Holy Roman Empire or even the Ottoman domains. If cartographers were simply filling blank spaces with imaginative names, why return to Tartaria consistently, century after century? Historians are still debating whether this persistence reflected genuine geographic knowledge or the inertia of tradition. The 18th century marks the turning point. In early atlases, Tartaria still looms large. But by mid-century, newer maps commissioned by Russia and other powers begin to omit the name. In its place appear detailed provinces: Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan. By the dawn of the 19th century, Tartaria is all but gone from mainstream cartography, surviving only in older atlases or minor references. The transformation is startlingly rapid. Within a few decades, an empire once depicted as massive simply vanishes from maps. The reasons for this disappearance remain contested. One explanation is that improved geographic knowledge, acquired through Russian exploration and conquest, revealed that no single empire occupied those lands. What Europeans had once called Tartaria was, in fact, a mosaic of smaller polities and tribes. Once this became clear, the broad label was abandoned in favour of precision. Another explanation, less conventional, argues that the erasure was intentional. According to this hypothesis, as Russia expanded, it had a vested interest in eliminating the memory of Tartaria, absorbing its lands not only physically but conceptually. To erase the name from maps was to erase the idea of a rival civilization. The possibility of suppression gains weight when one considers how maps have often been used as instruments of propaganda. The boundaries drawn on paper reflect political choices as much as geographic reality. Colonial powers routinely renamed lands, replacing indigenous identities with European ones. In the case of Tartaria, Russia's growing control over cartography in Eurasia may have ensured that European mapmakers adopted new terms favourable to imperial narratives. The shift coincided neatly with Russia's rise as a global power, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. There are peculiar details that complicate the story. In some 18th century atlases, Tartaria is reduced but not erased, relegated to small regions labelled Independent Tartary or Chinese Tartary. Why retain the name in fragments if the concept was entirely obsolete? Could it be that cartographers were reluctant to discard it completely, aware of sources they could not fully reconcile with the new imperial framework? Historians are still debating whether these fragments represent hesitation, ignorance, or traces of suppressed memory. An unusual off-topic incident highlights the stakes of mapmaking. In 1772, a British publisher released a world atlas that still prominently featured Tartaria. Within a decade, subsequent editions removed the name entirely, replacing it with Russian territories. The timing coincides with intensified diplomatic ties between Britain and Russia. Some theorists argue that the removal was not simply an update in knowledge, but a political concession, aligning British cartography with Russian claims. Whether deliberate or accidental, the result was the same. Tartaria vanished from British maps almost overnight. The disappearance from atlases also raises broader questions about the authority of maps. If Tartaria could exist on paper for centuries and then be erased with such ease, what does this say about the reliability of cartographic history? Are maps reflections of reality, or are they tools of those in power, shaping what future generations believe to be true? The erasure of Tartaria suggests the latter, and in doing so it echoes countless other acts of historical revision, where names, borders, and even entire peoples are written out of existence. Even today, old maps bearing the word Tartaria inspire fascination. Collectors prize them, and researchers pore over their details searching for clues. The very existence of these maps raises questions that cannot be ignored. If Tartaria was purely a European fantasy, why did it persist so long, and why did it vanish so suddenly? The silence of modern atlases does not erase the centuries in which Tartaria stood boldly across Eurasia, a reminder that history is never as fixed as it appears. The suppression of Tartaria on maps may have been the final act of its erasure. Yet the idea of an empire cannot be buried so easily. Even if the name was removed from paper, traces of Tartaria may linger in other aspects of culture, in religion, spirituality, and systems of belief that hint at a worldview unlike those of its conquerors. When empires fade from maps and chronicles, their voices may still echo in faith. Belief systems have always carried fragments of vanished cultures, preserved in ritual, symbol, and story long after political structures collapsed. If Tartaria truly existed, then traces of its spirit might still linger in the religious practices and cosmologies of the lands it once encompassed. The question of Tartarian religion is one of the most haunting, because it forces us to consider whether the silence surrounding Tartaria was not only political but also spiritual, whether a worldview was deliberately buried along with the memory of an empire. Missionary accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries provide some of the earliest glimpses. Jesuit travellers who journeyed across Siberia and into Central Asia often remarked upon ceremonies they witnessed among local peoples, ceremonies that seem both familiar and strange. One described gatherings where fire was carried in elaborate lamps and placed at the centre of public rituals, as if symbolising a divine presence. Another wrote of chants and incantations invoking the sky, the earth, and a realm beyond the stars. These practices were quickly categorised as shamanism by European observers, a term that lumped diverse spiritual traditions into a single vague label. Yet the consistency of the description suggests an organised cosmology, not merely scattered folk custom. Historians are still debating whether these rituals were remnants of an indigenous steppe faith, or fragments of something once codified under a broader Tartarian belief system. Architectural clues also suggest a spiritual dimension. Some of the enigmatic star forts, with their geometric symmetry, resemble not only military structures but also sacred mandalas, vast ground patterns that echo cosmic order. Alternative researchers propose that these forts may have doubled as ritual centres, designed to align with celestial bodies. Though mainstream historians reject this, noting the practical logic of such defensive designs, the possibility of spiritual symbolism in their construction cannot be dismissed entirely. After all, in many ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, practical and sacred architecture were inseparable. Symbols attributed to Tartaria are harder to pin down, yet scattered references exist. A few 17th century European engravings depict Tartarian coats of arms featuring double-headed eagles, suns, and crescent moons. These motifs are not unique to Tartaria. They also appear in Byzantine, Ottoman, and Russian iconography. But their presence in supposed Tartarian symbols suggests a shared language of sacred imagery, perhaps representing cosmic duality, cycles of time, or the balance of heaven and earth. Whether Tartaria adopted these motifs independently or passed them on to its conquerors is unknown. Religious syncretism complicates the story. Central Asia was a crossroads of belief. Islam spread through trade and conquest, Buddhism lingered in enclaves, and indigenous animist traditions persisted across Siberia. It is possible that Tartaria, if it existed, absorbed elements of all these systems, forging a unique cosmology. Some reports mention Tartarian rulers honouring multiple faiths simultaneously, permitting mosques, temples, and shrines within their cities. This echoes the Mongol practice of religious tolerance, but it could also point to an even older tradition of inclusivity. If so, Tartaria's faith may have been less about rigid doctrine and more about harmonizing diverse spiritual voices under a single order. A peculiar off-topic anecdote comes from an 18th century Russian explorer in Siberia, who claimed to have been shown a great underground chamber where locals preserved relics of their ancestors. Within, he saw idols of stone and bronze, some shaped like stars, others like towers. The explorer dismissed them as primitive fetishes, but later readers speculated they might have been remnants of Tartarian ritual, hidden away to escape destruction. Whether the story was exaggerated or genuine remains uncertain, but it hints at a deliberate attempt to conceal sacred objects from outsiders. Historians often struggle to disentangle faith from politics, especially in regions where conquest erased older systems. The Russian Orthodox Church expanded aggressively into Siberia, condemning local rituals as paganism and destroying sacred groves and idols. In this process, entire belief systems were silenced. Could Tartarian religion have been one of them? If the empire's cosmology conflicted with orthodoxy or Islam, its suppression would have been swift and thorough. The survival of fragments in folklore, sky worship, star symbolism, sacred fire, may be all that remains. There is also the question of cosmology. Some alternative researchers argue that Tartaria may have held a radically different view of the world itself. They point to old maps depicting lands at the North Pole or vast continents in the Arctic, suggesting that Tartarian cosmology included regions modern science denies. While these claims remain speculative, they highlight the possibility that Tartaria's spiritual worldview may have diverged fundamentally from those of its neighbours, making it all the more threatening to imperial powers that valued uniformity. Comparisons to other erased religions are telling. The Druids of ancient Europe left behind little written record, yet their influence is still felt in Celtic folklore. The Minoan religion of Crete was nearly lost until archaeologists unearthed its symbols in palaces and frescoes. If Tartaria once possessed a structured faith, its suppression could follow a similar pattern. A vibrant system reduced to whispers, its temples levelled, its idols buried, and its myths surviving only in fragments disguised as local tales. Historians are still debating whether these fragments amount to evidence of a unified Tartarian religion, or whether they are simply the patchwork of diverse steppe traditions. The lack of direct texts makes certainty impossible, yet the persistence of shared symbols, the geometric echoes in architecture, and the repeated missionary accounts of organised rituals suggest more than randomness. They suggest that Tartaria, whatever else it was, may have carried its own vision of the divine. If true, then the erasure of Tartaria was not only political but cosmological. To silence its voice was to silence an alternative worldview, one that might have offered a different story of humanity's place in the universe. And that silence, more than the loss of borders or dynasties, is what makes the mystery of Tartaria so haunting. The question of religion leads naturally to another puzzle. If Tartaria was so vast, why did the explorers of the so-called Age of Discovery, who crossed oceans and charted continents, leave so little detailed record of it? The 16th and 17th centuries are remembered as the Age of Exploration, an era when European navigators crossed uncharted oceans, mapped new continents, and filled their atlases with discoveries that reshaped the world. In this great unfolding of global geography, nearly every coast was charted, every trade route described, and every kingdom contacted in some form. And yet, in the midst of this fever of discovery, Tartaria remained a blank, its name scrawled across maps but its details strangely absent. Explorers who could find islands in the middle of the Pacific or chart the jungles of South America left remarkably little testimony about the supposed empire that sprawled across northern Asia. This blind spot is one of the most puzzling aspects of Tartaria's mystery. The explanation often given by mainstream historians is simple. Tartaria was not a real empire, but a European label for lands too distant, too inhospitable, or too politically fragmented to describe accurately. Exploration, after all, was driven by commerce. The coasts of Africa offered gold, the Indies offered spices, the Americas promised silver and tobacco. The frozen tundra and endless steppe of Siberia offered little that could lure explorers from Europe. Thus, while Tartaria was marked on maps, few adventurers sought it out directly. Instead, knowledge filtered through intermediaries, Russians, Persians, and later the Qing dynasty of China, who shaped what Europeans believed about the region. Yet this explanation leaves troubling gaps. Why did explorers who wrote volumes about the minutest details of other lands remain so vague about Tartaria? Why did the most renowned travellers of the age, men like Marco Polo before them, and later the Jesuits who roamed across Asia, describe Mongol, Chinese and Indian courts in detail, yet offer so little about Tartarian rulers or cities? Could it be that such cities did exist, but were systematically misattributed to other empires? Or were they deliberately omitted from reports to avoid drawing attention to a rival civilization? Historians are still debating whether this silence reflects ignorance, neglect, or suppression. Russian expansion offers one possible clue. As Muscovy advanced eastward, it gradually monopolized European access to Siberia. Foreign travellers required Russian permission to enter, and their reports were filtered through imperial supervision. If Tartaria had remnants of autonomy or even grandeur, Russian authorities may have had reason to obscure it, presenting the land instead as wilderness newly tamed. This would explain why foreign explorers often describe Siberia in terms of natural resources, fur, timber, minerals, rather than urban centres or advanced societies. The narrative of wilderness made Russian conquest appear more heroic and inevitable. There is also the strange matter of Jesuit silence. The Society of Jesus was deeply invested in Asia during the 17th and 18th centuries, sending missions to China, Japan, India, and beyond. Their letters back to Europe brim with ethnographic detail, notes on languages, descriptions of rituals, sketches of architecture. Yet when it comes to the vast space Europeans call Tartaria, the Jesuits are curiously vague. Some letters mention passing through Tartar lands or meeting Tartar princes, but none provide sustained ethnographic accounts. Could this have been because Tartaria was already under Russian or Chinese suppression, making access difficult? Or did the Jesuits, whose missions often depended on imperial goodwill, avoid describing something their hosts preferred to keep hidden? Odd fragments, however, do surface. A Jesuit stationed in Beijing in the late 17th century mentioned in his correspondence that the Qing emperor received ambassadors from the north of the Tartars, who brought gifts of unusual metals and mechanical devices. He did not elaborate further. Was this a vague description of Mongol or Siberian tribes, or was it a fleeting glimpse of organised Tartarian diplomacy? Scholars remain divided, unsure whether to treat such references as routine or extraordinary. The absence of Tartaria in European travel literature becomes all the more glaring when one considers the voracious appetite for exotic tales. Publishers in London, Paris and Amsterdam eagerly printed accounts of faraway lands, even when those accounts were filled with exaggeration or fantasy. Books describing cannibals in the New World, giant birds in Madagascar, or cities of gold in South America found enthusiastic readers. Why then did so few books describe the wonders of Tartaria, despite its enormous presence on maps? If nothing else, one might expect fabricated tales. Instead, there is silence, a silence that feels intentional. A peculiar off-topic event illustrates how such silence can be engineered. In 1733, a London publisher announced the release of a travelogue titled Travels in Tartary, supposedly recounting the journey of a merchant across northern Asia. Within weeks, the book was withdrawn and very few copies survived. Rumours circulated that it had been suppressed due to pressure from foreign envoys. Whether true or not, the incident demonstrates how easily narratives could be controlled, especially when they touched upon politically sensitive regions. Even when Tartaria does appear in European accounts, it is often framed in terms of fear rather than detail. Descriptions of Tartar hordes evoke images of wild horsemen and unending steppes, echoing the terror of Mongol invasions centuries earlier. Such portrayals reduce Tartaria to a symbol of barbarism, an amorphous threat rather than a civilization. The nuance of urban centres, technologies, or belief systems is conspicuously absent. This reduction may have served both political and psychological needs, simplifying the unknown into a manageable stereotype. It is also worth noting that the age of exploration was not equally interested in every direction. Europe's gaze turned outward to the seas, where colonial wealth could be seized. Tartaria, by contrast, was landlocked, remote, and controlled by powerful intermediaries. Perhaps the explorer's silence reflects nothing more than the priorities of empire, and yet the consistency of the omission, combined with the sudden erasure of Tartaria from maps, makes the blind spot suspicious. It is as though the world's greatest age of discovery walked carefully around a secret, leaving a blank where an empire might have stood. The blind spot invites speculation. If explorers avoided Tartaria, who remained to carry its memory forward? Perhaps it was the displaced peoples, the scattered survivors who carried fragments of culture into exile, embedding Tartarian echoes in the traditions of nomads and indigenous groups. Their legends may hold the last living embers of an erased civilization. If Tartaria truly existed, and if its erasure was as thorough as maps, chronicles, and conquest suggest, then surely some fragments of its people survived. Civilizations, after all, do not vanish into nothing. They disperse, fragment, and adapt. Their ruins may crumble, their names may fade, but their customs and stories often persist in the scattered communities that once lived under their shadow. The displaced and wandering peoples of northern Asia, Siberia and Central Asia may hold in their legends and lifeways the faintest echoes of what Tartaria once was. The most immediate candidates are the various groups labelled as Tatars by Russia and Europe: Volga Tatars, Crimean Tatars, Siberian Tatars. These identities remain today, distinct yet bound together by the shared imprint of an older name. Historians usually explain them as Turkic or Mongolic peoples, assimilated into Russia over centuries. Yet their persistence suggests something deeper. Oral traditions among some of these communities speak of great ancestors who once ruled vast lands, of cities swallowed by soil, and of a northern empire that was lost. Whether these are poetic exaggerations or distorted memories of Tartaria is uncertain, but the parallels are striking. Indigenous Siberian groups also preserve enigmatic traditions. The Yakuts, for instance, maintain epic cycles of song, the Olonko, which describe migrations from ancestral homelands filled with stone dwellings and powerful rulers. These songs, passed orally for centuries, may encode faint memories of a larger civilization. Likewise, the Buryats tell stories of a people who lived in fortified settlements before being scattered to the steppes. Mainstream ethnographers often treat these as myth, allegories of survival in harsh landscapes. Yet within their imagery, stone cities, lost rulers, vanished lands, one hears whispers of something that once existed but no longer has a name. There are also traces in Central Asian nomadic groups, particularly among the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. Folk tales describe encounters with the white cities of the north, often portrayed as places of wonder and terror, inhabited by rulers with command over unusual technologies or powers. These stories may reflect encounters with Russian expansion or borrowed imagery from Persian legends, but they could also represent distorted recollections of Tartarian strongholds, remembered by those who survived their fall. Historians are still debating whether such legends are evidence of cultural memory or the result of folklore blending across centuries. The survival of fragments is not limited to oral tradition. Certain architectural motifs among nomadic groups stand out. Portable yurts, while seemingly simple, sometimes bear geometric decorations reminiscent of patterns found in supposedly Tartarian ruins. Whether this continuity is coincidental or deliberate is difficult to prove, but it suggests that even mobile cultures preserved elements of a broader aesthetic once shared across the region. An unusual off-topic event illustrates the persistence of memory. In 1817, a Russian officer travelling through Siberia recorded a local tale of a city buried beneath a lake. The villagers claimed that on clear nights one could see towers beneath the water's surface. The officer dismissed it as fantasy, but stories of sunken cities recur in many Siberian traditions. Could these be symbolic metaphors for lost homelands, or do they preserve dim recollections of real Tartarian settlements now destroyed by flood or geological change? The scattered survivors also appear in the records of empire. 19th century Russian censuses often listed large populations simply as Tatars, a vague label that erased distinctions. Within these groups, some communities claim descent from noble lines, insisting their ancestors had once been rulers of lands far larger than their present villages. Russian officials, intent on consolidating control, paid little attention to such claims. Yet these voices hint at identities that once tied themselves to something greater, a memory of sovereignty lost to conquest. There are linguistic fragments too. Among the Siberian Tatars, certain prayers and ceremonial songs include words that linguists cannot neatly trace to Turkic, Mongolic, or Slavic roots. These stray terms may be relics of an extinct language, perhaps once common across wider regions. The fact that they survive only in ritual context suggests deliberate preservation, even when daily speech changed. If Tartaria had a lingua franca, such words might be its last echoes. The survival of scattered peoples raises a larger question. If Tartaria existed, why did it not persist through diaspora, as other fallen empires have? The Jews preserved their identity in exile, Armenians carried theirs across continents, and even the remnants of Rome lived on in Byzantium. Why not Tartaria? One answer may be the scale of its erasure. If the Great Reset hypothesis holds truth, if floods, mud, or conquest obliterated its cities, then its survivors may have been reduced to fragments too small to preserve a cohesive identity. Assimilation into Russian, Chinese, and Islamic spheres would have accelerated the process, dissolving Tartaria into many smaller names. And yet, the very persistence of the Tatar identity complicates this narrative, for despite centuries of conquest and assimilation, millions today still identify as Tatars. Could it be that this name, though reshaped, is the last surviving ember of Tartaria? Historians are still debating whether the word's continuity represents a direct line of descent or merely the endurance of a convenient label. The scattered survivors may not hold the full memory of Tartaria, but they hold enough to trouble the silence. Their legends of lost cities, their songs of vanished rulers, their linguistic fragments, and their stubborn persistence under the name Tatar all suggest that something once bound them together, something greater than the fragments we see today. If survivors carried echoes of Tartaria into the present, then perhaps science might yet uncover physical traces to support their stories. Archaeology, geology, and climate data may contain anomalies that hint at a buried past, waiting to be unearthed. The ruins of cities may crumble, and the songs of survivors may fade, but science can sometimes speak where memory falls silent. In the case of Tartaria, the tools of archaeology, geology, and climate research have uncovered anomalies that continue to stir debate. They are not proofs, but puzzles, fragments that do not easily fit into the accepted narrative of Central Asian and Siberian history. For those searching for Tartaria, these scientific oddities become tantalizing hints of a lost civilization erased from the record. Archaeologists working in the Siberian and Kazakh steppes have long been struck by the presence of settlement remains far larger than expected for nomadic societies. In several regions, excavations have revealed stone foundations and street grids beneath layers of soil, some of which appear to date back only a few centuries. These sites are often interpreted as trade posts established by the Russians or Chinese, but certain features complicate that explanation. For example, the size and symmetry of the layouts, with avenues aligned to cardinal directions, resemble urban planning on a scale more typical of established empires than temporary outposts. Historians are still debating whether these ruins represent local adaptations or fragments of a forgotten order. Geology also raises questions. Across parts of Siberia and Central Asia, researchers have documented thick layers of silt and clay covering older structures, consistent with sudden floods or soil liquefaction. Mainstream science attributes these layers to natural flooding events from swollen rivers or glacial activity. Yet the sheer extent of these deposits, sometimes stretching for hundreds of kilometers, has led alternative theorists to argue for a continent-wide catastrophe, the same event that mudflood hypotheses claim destroyed Tartaria. Conventional geologists reject such sweeping conclusions, pointing to the absence of evidence for recent global-scale disasters. But the local anomalies remain difficult to explain, particularly where buried architecture is discovered beneath several meters of soil. Climate science introduces another dimension. Tree ring data and ice core samples suggest that between the 16th and 19th centuries, Eurasia experienced several periods of abrupt climate stress, including the so-called Little Ice Age. Harsh winters, shortened growing seasons, and sudden floods would have disrupted agricultural societies. If Tartaria relied on a complex urban infrastructure, such climatic upheaval might have weakened its stability, leaving it vulnerable to conquest or collapse. The coincidence of these environmental stresses with Russia's eastward expansion fuels speculation that Tartaria may have been undone by both nature and empire, a dual blow that erased its traces. Strange artifacts further deepen the mystery. In scattered museum collections, researchers have noted items of unclear origin, intricately cast bronze pieces, gears, and spherical objects recovered from Siberian soil. Most are dismissed as industrial debris from later centuries, but a few defy easy categorization. One well-known example is the so-called Shigir idol, a 9,000-year-old wooden statue discovered in the Urals. Though predating Tartaria by millennia, its geometric carving suggests a continuity of symbolic language that resonates eerily with later architectural motifs in the region. Could Tartaria have drawn upon far older traditions, carrying forward symbols already ancient in prehistory? Scholars disagree, but the possibility lingers. An unusual off-topic event adds to the sense of anomaly. In 1987, geologists conducting surveys in Siberia reported finding perfectly spherical metallic objects buried deep underground. These objects, said to range from small marbles to large orbs, were claimed to be hollow with unusually hard surfaces. Most were dismissed as natural concretions, a geological phenomenon where minerals crystallize into rounded forms. Yet local legends had long spoken of iron eggs of the earth, associated with ancient rulers. Whether natural or artificial, the discovery blurred the line between folklore and science. Satellite imagery has opened new avenues of investigation. From above, researchers have identified massive geometric earthworks in northern Kazakhstan. Giant crosses, circles, and radial designs etched into the steppe. Some of these geoglyphs measure hundreds of meters across. Mainstream archaeologists believe they were ceremonial or ritual structures built by prehistoric cultures thousands of years ago. Alternative theorists argue they may instead represent the remains of Tartarian engineering, visible only from the sky, perhaps designed with astronomical alignment in mind. The dating of these earthworks remains contested, and historians are still debating whether they represent continuity of forgotten traditions or isolated creations unrelated to later civilizations. Climate anomalies also intersect with human memory and folklore. Tales of sudden freezes, cities buried in snow, and rivers that shifted course overnight are common across Siberian traditions. Some of these accounts align with evidence of abrupt climatic shifts during the Little Ice Age. Could such events have buried or destroyed Tartarian settlements, leaving only scattered survivors? If so, then geology and folklore may together preserve the story of a civilization erased by nature's violence. Skeptics caution against reading too much into anomalies. After all, unusual artifacts, floods and ruins are common in every region of the world. Yet what makes Tartaria different is the scale of the coincidence. Buried architecture, unexplained artifacts, and folklore of catastrophe all appear across a territory once consistently labelled Tartaria on maps. Even if each anomaly can be explained in isolation, together they weave a pattern that resists easy dismissal. The scientific anomalies then do not prove Tartaria's existence, but they keep the question alive. They remind us that history is not only what is written, but also what is buried, waiting beneath layers of earth, ice, and silence. If Tartaria was ever real, its traces may yet lie beneath our feet, disguised as natural formations or mislabeled as something else. And if architecture, climate, and science all hint at something erased, perhaps the most public and visible remnants lie in plain sight, in the grand monuments and strange exhibitions of the 19th century, where Tartaria's architectural language may have been displayed under another name. The 19th century was an age of spectacle. Across Europe and the Americas, great expositions and world fairs presented the triumph of industrial progress. Enormous exhibition halls, glass domes, and palatial complexes were built in astonishingly short time frames, often dismantled just as quickly. To many, these events were proof of modern ingenuity, the ability of industry and empire to summon grandeur seemingly out of nothing. Yet to those who look for Tartaria, these exhibitions tell another story, one of inherited architecture, rebranded as temporary display, concealing the remnants of a lost civilization beneath the banners of modernity. The scale of these structures remains bewildering. Consider the Crystal Palace of London's Great Exhibition of 1851, a massive iron and glass building covering 990,000 square feet, supposedly constructed in less than a year. Or the sprawling white city of Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893, a gleaming landscape of domes, columns and lagoons, assembled in record time and later dismantled. Even Paris's Exposition Universelle of 1900 presented monumental works, immense halls, bridges and towers that many visitors described as rivaling ancient empires in splendour. Historians explain these achievements as feats of industrial efficiency, made possible by prefabrication and an abundance of labour. Yet skeptics wonder, could such vast complexes truly have been designed, constructed, and decorated in such short order? Or were they older structures, refurbished and showcased as new? The suspicion deepens when one examines the designs themselves. Many exposition buildings bore architectural styles more reminiscent of classical antiquity or Baroque palaces than of the industrial age. Domes and colonnades echoed the grandeur of Rome, Byzantium, or even Eastern traditions, but without clear explanation for why such designs would be chosen for temporary buildings. Alternative theorists argue that these structures were not new creations at all, but remnants of Tartarian architecture repurposed by modern powers. According to this view, the fairs served as controlled spectacles, presenting the remnants of a suppressed empire as marvels of contemporary design, before erasing them once more through demolition. Historians strongly dispute this interpretation, citing blueprints, construction records, and photographs that document the building of exposition sites. Yet anomalies persist. In some cases, records of construction appear suspiciously incomplete, with scant detail on how materials were transported or assembled so rapidly. In others, demolition was carried out with surprising haste, erasing evidence that might have revealed older foundations beneath. The pattern recalls the deliberate burial of past civilizations, raising the unsettling possibility that what was presented as progress may have been, at least in part, concealment. Odd details in visitors' accounts add to the mystery. Travellers at the 1893 Chicago Fair wrote of palaces that seemed too old to be new, as though they had been waiting beneath the soil. In St. Louis during the 1904 World's Fair, some visitors remarked that certain buildings felt permanent despite being labelled temporary. These impressions could reflect nothing more than the awe inspired by monumental scale. But to those who see Tartaria in the background, they suggest that the architecture of power was not created overnight, but inherited from an older civilization whose identity had been erased. One peculiar off-topic event highlights this suspicion. In 1910, while excavating foundations in St. Petersburg, Russian workers uncovered stone structures beneath the streets that matched the dimensions of surface buildings. Some claim these were older levels of the same architecture, buried by soil and later built upon. The discovery attracted little official notice, dismissed as routine urban layering. Yet it echoes the mudflood hypothesis, that lower levels of Tartarian buildings were buried and reused, their true origin lost in the rush to claim them as modern. The symbolic language of the expositions also deserves attention. Many fairs prominently featured statues of winged figures, globes and radiant suns, motifs also associated with alleged Tartarian symbols in maps and heraldry. Were these mere coincidences, or conscious echoes of an older tradition? Historians argue that such symbols were common in neoclassical art, borrowed from Greece and Rome. But the overlap keeps speculation alive. Perhaps these motifs persisted because they were remnants of a suppressed cosmology, passed down unconsciously through architecture and art. Even demolition raises questions. Why dismantle structures that had cost so much to build? Officially, most fairs were designed to be temporary, too costly to maintain long-term. Yet some demolitions were carried out with remarkable speed and thoroughness, leaving almost no trace of complexes that had dazzled thousands only months before. To alternative thinkers, this destruction was not economic pragmatism, but deliberate erasure, a way to remove evidence of Tartaria once it had been rebranded as modern marvels. It is important to acknowledge that mainstream scholarship sees no Tartarian fingerprints here. To historians, the world fairs were products of their time, ambitious, extravagant, and fleeting demonstrations of industrial power. But to those who read anomalies differently, the architecture of power looks less like invention and more like inheritance. The question is not simply whether these buildings were Tartarian, but whether the entire narrative of modern progress rests upon older foundations. If Tartaria's architectural language truly survived into the 19th century, then its erasure was not just physical but conceptual, woven into the narratives of colonial empires that claimed to have built the modern world from scratch. The destruction of exposition halls may have been one of the last acts in the long suppression of Tartaria, the silencing of a rival civilization by rebranding its creations as temporary spectacles. And this leads naturally to the next question. Who would have benefited most from such erasure, and why? To answer that, one must examine the role of colonial narratives themselves, the stories empires told to assert their dominance, and the histories they rewrote to eliminate competitors from the past. The erasure of Tartaria cannot be understood without considering the narratives of empire. Colonial powers did not merely conquer territories, they conquered memory. To justify expansion, they rewrote the past, reframed indigenous histories as primitive, and presented themselves as the sole bearers of civilization. If Tartaria had once been a sophisticated power stretching across Eurasia, its memory would have posed a direct threat to the legitimacy of rising empires, Russia, China, and the colonial powers of Europe. The most effective way to neutralize such a threat would have been not only to defeat Tartaria physically, but also to erase it from the story of humanity. Russia, expanding eastward in the 17th and 18th centuries, had the clearest motive. By portraying Siberia and Central Asia as wilderness inhabited only by nomads, the Tsars transformed conquest into a civilizing mission. The narrative was simple. Russia was bringing order where none had existed. Acknowledging Tartaria as an organized empire with cities, infrastructure, and a belief system would have undermined that narrative, revealing that Russia had not discovered emptiness, but had consumed a rival civilization. Thus, in chronicles, censuses, and official histories, Tartars became little more than wandering tribes, erasing the possibility of their empire. China too had reasons to participate in the silencing. The Qing dynasty sought to consolidate authority over Inner Asia, including Mongolia and Tibet. By absorbing or fragmenting the memory of Tartaria into categories like Chinese Tartary, the Qing could frame its expansion as the natural extension of an eternal Chinese order. To acknowledge a distinct Tartarian civilization would have complicated this narrative, implying the existence of a legitimate neighbour that had been conquered rather than integrated. European colonial powers also contributed, though in subtler ways. During the Age of Enlightenment, European scholars worked to categorize the world in encyclopedias and atlases. They classified races, languages, and civilizations, often with little first-hand knowledge. Tartaria appeared in early editions of these works as a vast empire, but by the 19th century, its entry had shrunk to a vague geographic term. Why? Some argue that it reflected better knowledge acquired through Russian sources. Others suspect that Europe, increasingly reliant on Russia as a geopolitical ally and trading partner, accepted Moscow's narrative of an empty Siberia rather than challenging it with older cartographic traditions. Colonial narratives also had psychological functions. To portray conquered lands as formally advanced would raise uncomfortable questions about conquest and destruction. It was far more convenient to insist that there had been nothing of value before European or imperial arrival. In Africa, this logic erased the grandeur of kingdoms like Mali and Great Zimbabwe. In the Americas, it minimized the sophistication of the Maya and Inca. If Tartaria had once stretched across half of Asia, it would have posed an even greater challenge to the myth of progress. Erasing it allowed empires to claim they were the sole architects of modernity. An odd off-topic incident demonstrates how narratives are shaped. In 1705, a French scholar presented a paper on the ancient empire of Tartary to the Academy of Sciences in Paris. His argument, based on maps and travellers' accounts, suggested that Tartaria had once rivaled Rome and China in scale. The paper was politely dismissed, archived, and rarely mentioned again. Some theorists suggest that political pressure discouraged further study, as Napoleon at the time sought alliances with Russia. Whether suppression was intentional or simply the result of scholarly disinterest, the effect was the same. Tartaria remained excluded from the grand narrative of world civilizations. Symbols of colonial authority often reinforced this erasure. Statues, maps, and school books depicted the empire as the bringer of civilization to wild lands. Russian textbooks of the 19th century describe Siberia as a barren frontier until the arrival of Russian settlers, with little acknowledgement of prior cities or states. Chinese records presented Mongol and steppe powers as brief interruptions in the eternal dominance of Chinese civilization. European atlases dropped Tartaria altogether, leaving no space for alternative interpretations. Historians are still debating whether this erasure was conscious policy or the natural outcome of shifting knowledge. Some argue that as geography improved, Tartaria simply proved unnecessary as a label. Others believe that silence itself was strategic, a way to close off uncomfortable questions about conquest, destruction, and the true complexity of the lands absorbed by empire. The role of colonial narratives also explains why Tartaria resonates so strongly today. To question its erasure is to question the very foundations of imperial history. If empires lied about Tartaria, what else might they have concealed? The debate reflects not only curiosity about the past, but also skepticism about the narrative still taught in schools and museums. Tartaria becomes a symbol of hidden history, of the possibility that entire civilizations can be deleted, not by time, but by intention. Yet even in erasure, fragments survived. Symbols, heraldry, and forgotten flags occasionally appear in archives, bearing the name of Tartaria. These emblems, half remembered and scattered, may represent the last visible traces of a civilization deliberately pushed to the margins. Even when names fade from maps and chronicles fall silent, symbols often linger in unexpected places. Heraldry, flags, and emblems serve as condensed expressions of identity, carrying within their designs the memory of entire peoples. In the case of Tartaria, a few scattered symbols survive, fragments that hint at sovereignty, unity, and perhaps a deeper cosmology. While their meanings are contested, these emblems provide one of the few tangible threads, linking Tartaria to a political identity beyond rumour and speculation. European heraldic treatises of the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally include entries for Tartary alongside the arms of other kingdoms. Some depict a crowned rider on horseback, spear in hand, representing martial power. Others show the double-headed eagle, an ancient emblem associated with dual authority over East and West. In one collection, a sun radiating over mountains is labelled as the arms of Tartaria. Whether these were genuine Tartarian symbols or European inventions remains debated. Yet their inclusion alongside the coats of arms of established realms suggests that, in the European imagination, Tartaria was viewed as a legitimate political entity, deserving of heraldic representation. Flags attributed to Tartaria are even more enigmatic. A few 17th century naval charts record ships said to belong to Tartarian lords, flying banners with crescent moons or stars. These may reflect confusion with Ottoman or Central Asian symbols, but their attribution is consistent enough to raise questions. Why would European cartographers invent flags for a non-existent empire? Historians are still debating whether these were symbolic placeholders, misunderstandings, or echoes of real encounters with Tartarian envoys. An odd case appears in a 1705 armorial published in France, where Tartaria is given multiple banners, one with a white field and red sun, another with crossed arrows beneath a crown. These designs do not correspond neatly to Mongol or Turkic traditions, suggesting either artistic invention or fragments of an independent heraldic system. Alternative researchers argue that such symbols reflect Tartaria's claim to cosmic order, with suns and arrows representing celestial authority and earthly power. Mainstream historians dismiss these interpretations, pointing out that many armorials freely invented designs for distant lands. The debate remains unresolved, but the persistence of Tartarian arms across several sources is difficult to ignore. Symbols also appear in travelogues. A German traveller in the 17th century wrote of encountering banners in Central Asia depicting a black eagle on a golden field, said to belong to the king of Tartaria. While this may have been confusion with the heraldry of neighbouring khanates, the traveller recorded it with confidence, as though the emblem carried recognised authority. Similarly, a Jesuit missionary described a ceremonial gathering where chiefs raised standards bearing stylised suns and moons, which he interpreted as signs of dual religious authority. Whether these were Tartarian symbols or local variations remains unclear, but their consistent association with order and rulership suggests a deeper meaning. One peculiar off-topic event comes from an 18th century British Museum catalogue, which listed among its holdings a Tartar flag of conquest, said to have been brought back by an explorer. The description noted a fabric embroidered with stars and flames, unlike any known Ottoman or Persian design. The flag later disappeared from the collection, with no surviving illustration. Some believe it was a misattributed Central Asian banner. Others speculate it was a genuine relic of a Tartarian polity, lost to neglect or deliberate removal. Even coins provide hints. A handful of numismatic collections contain coins from Central Asia, with inscriptions that remain difficult to categorize. Some feature sunbursts or eagles with unusual stylization, not easily placed within established dynasties. While most are attributed to local khanates, alternative thinkers suggest they may represent Tartarian minting, the financial emblem of a civilization whose memory has otherwise vanished. Scholars remain cautious, noting that coin iconography often overlaps across regions. Still, the anomalies add to the mosaic of unexplained symbols. The persistence of these emblems raises an important question. If Tartaria was merely a European fiction, why would heraldic treatises, naval charts, and travel accounts consistently assign it arms and flags? Was this purely invention, or did Europeans encounter genuine symbols of authority now erased from mainstream history? Historians are still debating whether the evidence reflects misunderstanding or suppressed reality. Symbols also connect to identity beyond politics. The use of suns, moons, and eagles suggests a cosmological framework, rulership linked to celestial authority. Many civilizations have used such imagery, but in Tartaria's case the combination may reveal how its rulers viewed themselves, as mediators between heaven and earth, guardians of order in a vast and diverse land. If true, then Tartarian heraldry preserved not only political sovereignty, but also a spiritual worldview. Even if Tartaria itself was erased, its symbols may have survived by absorption. Russia adopted the double-headed eagle as its emblem, while the crescent moon remained central in Islamic states of Central Asia. Could these adoptions reflect inheritance rather than coincidence? Some alternative historians argue that Russia did not merely conquer Tartaria, but appropriated its emblems, ensuring continuity under a new name. Mainstream scholars remain skeptical, but the visual similarities remain provocative. The scattered arms and forgotten flags do not provide definitive proof of Tartaria, but they add weight to its shadow. They suggest that someone, somewhere, claimed authority under that name, enough for Europeans to record its symbols alongside those of recognized realms. And in the persistence of these emblems, there is a faint assertion of identity, a whisper that Tartaria once spoke in banners and crests, even if its voice has since been silenced. But symbols alone cannot resurrect a civilization. To understand how Tartaria lives today, one must turn to the modern rediscovery of the idea itself, the revival of interest in a forgotten empire through digital communities, alternative histories, and the strange convergence of folklore and speculation in the 21st century. For nearly 2 centuries, Tartaria lay silent, absent from maps, ignored in textbooks, and dismissed as a relic of cartographic error. Yet in the modern age, the name has returned with unexpected force. Unlike its presence in the armorials and atlases of the past, Tartaria today exists not through official institutions but through rediscovery, revived by researchers, hobbyists and digital communities who piece together fragments of evidence in search of a forgotten empire. The phenomenon is more than curiosity. It reflects a growing distrust of official history and a hunger for alternative narratives that challenge the certainties taught in schools and museums. The rediscovery began quietly in the late 20th century when collectors of old maps noticed the frequent appearance of Tartaria in atlases printed before the 19th century. These collectors, often working outside academic circles, compared editions of Mercator, Ortelius, and other cartographers, noting how Great Tartary occupied vast stretches of Asia before vanishing entirely from later maps. The abrupt disappearance seemed too sudden to be innocent. For some, it became evidence of suppression. Why would a land so consistently marked vanish from cartography within decades, unless its memory had been deliberately erased? With the rise of the internet, these questions spread rapidly. Online forums and later social media platforms became hubs where enthusiasts shared scans of old maps, photographs of anomalous architecture, and personal interpretations of history. The term Tartaria became shorthand for a hidden narrative, one that suggested the world we know has been built atop the ruins of an empire erased from consciousness. These discussions expanded beyond maps, linking Tartaria to the mudflood hypothesis, to unexplained architectural marvels, and even to the mysterious world fairs of the 19th century. Mainstream historians initially dismissed the revival as fringe speculation, yet the persistence of the movement speaks to deeper currents in modern culture. Many people feel alienated by official narratives that reduce history to neat timelines of nation-states and progress. Tartaria offers an alternative, a story of a lost civilization that was vast, advanced, and systematically hidden. It appeals not only to curiosity but also to the desire for wonder, for the possibility that the world still holds secrets, that beneath the surface of familiar streets and institutions lie forgotten depths. The rediscovery also intersects with archaeology and architecture. Digital communities have amassed thousands of photographs of buildings across Europe, Asia, and the Americas that display ornate facades, buried lower floors, and grand styles seemingly out of step with their supposed construction dates. These are presented as Tartarian remnants, hidden in plain sight. Critics argue that such anomalies are easily explained by urban development, subsidence, or the eclectic borrowing of architectural styles. But for those seeking Tartaria, the very ubiquity of these features suggests inheritance, the persistence of a suppressed architectural language. An unusual off-topic event demonstrates the intensity of this rediscovery. In 2019, a group of enthusiasts staged a Tartarian walking tour of St. Petersburg, guiding participants to buildings with half-buried windows, ornate facades, and unexplained construction anomalies. The tour framed the city as a living museum of Tartaria, presenting its architecture not as Imperial Russian, but as inherited from a lost civilization. The event attracted media attention, sparking debate about the line between speculative history and performance art. While mainstream scholars criticized it as pseudoscience, participants described it as liberating, a way to see familiar streets through new eyes. Digital rediscovery has also fostered connections across cultures. Forums dedicated to Tartaria attract contributors from Russia, Europe, Asia, and the Americas, each bringing local evidence. A buried church in Siberia, a star fort in Italy, a temporary exposition hall in Chicago, all are linked into a global puzzle. This international scope has given Tartaria a new life, not as a localized empire, but as a symbol of hidden history worldwide. It resonates with those who feel that the past has been sanitized, stripped of its mysteries by academic gatekeepers. Historians are still debating how to interpret the phenomenon of modern Tartaria, Some view it as a digital age myth, born of pattern-seeking and fueled by skepticism toward authority. Others see it as part of a larger cultural movement that questions the narratives of empire, colonialism, and progress. Either way, the rediscovery of Tartaria is as much about the present as about the past. It reflects modern anxieties about truth, memory, and the possibility of manipulation on a vast scale. For those who pursue the question, Tartaria is not just an empire that might have existed. It is a metaphor for erasure itself, a reminder that history is written by victors and that silence may conceal more than absence. The scattered evidence, maps, symbols, architecture, anomalies, may never coalesce into definitive proof. But the act of searching keeps Tartaria alive, turning absence into presence through the persistence of curiosity. As Tartaria re-emerges in digital forums and global conversations, the line between myth and reality grows thin. Is it a civilization rediscovered, or a story invented anew? Perhaps it is both, a myth that carries within it a kernel of truth, or a truth preserved only through myth. This tension leads naturally to the next stage of the story, the boundary between myth and reality, where evidence collides with imagination, and where Tartaria exists both as a historical question and as a cultural phenomenon of belief. The closer one draws to Tartaria, the more it seems to dissolve into ambiguity. It is both everywhere and nowhere, present on centuries of maps, whispered in folklore, glimpsed in architecture, yet absent from official chronicles and archaeological consensus. At this threshold, one encounters the uneasy space between myth and reality. For some, Tartaria is nothing more than a phantom, a European cartographic mistake inflated into conspiracy. For others, it is the shadow of a civilization deliberately erased. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, woven from fragments of memory, invention, and selective forgetting. Myth and reality often intertwine in the stories of lost civilizations. Atlantis, first described by Plato, may have been allegory, yet it continues to inspire speculation about real cultures drowned by the sea. The city of Troy was long dismissed as myth, until archaeology revealed its ruins. The Indus Valley civilization remained unknown to the modern world until rediscovered beneath the plains of Pakistan and India. These precedents remind us that myths can preserve kernels of truth, encoded in story long after direct memory fades. Could Tartaria belong to this category? Neither pure fiction nor fully historical, but a blurred memory of something that once was. The strongest argument for Tartaria as myth rests on the vagueness of the evidence. No inscriptions, chronicles, or monuments bear the name unequivocally. Maps labelled Tartaria may simply reflect European ignorance, lumping together lands beyond their knowledge. Symbols attributed to Tartaria may have been artistic inventions. Even the anomalies of architecture and geology may be overinterpretations of ordinary processes. To mainstream historians, Tartaria is a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeing patterns where none exist, of allowing imagination to fill gaps in evidence. And yet, the reality of erasure complicates the skepticism. Empires have repeatedly destroyed the memory of rivals. The Assyrians obliterated the names of rebellious cities from inscriptions. The Romans declared Carthage erased from history. Colonizers across the globe dismissed indigenous civilizations as primitive, even when standing amid their ruins. In this light, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If Tartaria existed, it may have been subjected to one of the most thorough erasures in history, leaving behind only fragments too ambiguous to convict but too persistent to dismiss. The truth may lie in a synthesis. Perhaps Tartaria was not a single empire in the sense of Rome or China, but a network of polities across Eurasia that shared cultural, architectural, and technological traditions. Europeans, encountering fragments of this network, applied a single label, Tartaria. Over time, as empires consumed these regions, the name was deliberately removed and the memory fragmented. In this interpretation, Tartaria is both real and myth. Real as a constellation of advanced societies, myth as a unified empire spanning half the continent. An unusual off-topic story illustrates this blending. In the late 18th century, a Russian folklorist recorded a tale from Siberian peasants about a city that once shone with towers of glass, whose rulers could speak across distances with voices of lightning. When asked where the city was, the storytellers pointed to a field of ruins covered by earth. The folklorist dismissed the account as fantasy, yet centuries later, fragments of advanced communication and electrical experimentation became real in human history. Could the tale preserve a distorted memory of lost technologies, or was it merely the imagination of peasants retelling myths in the language of wonder? The story straddles the line between myth and reality, as Tartaria itself seems to do. Historians are still debating how to approach this paradox. Some argue that the modern fascination with Tartaria says more about the present than the past, about distrust of authority, about the hunger for mystery in a rationalized world, and about the human need to believe that hidden truths still await discovery. Others caution that dismissing all anomalies as fantasy risks repeating the arrogance of past scholars who declared Troy or the Indus Valley mere myths. Between myth and reality lies uncertainty, and it is in this space that Tartaria lives. It is not solid enough to enter textbooks, yet it is not fragile enough to vanish completely. It haunts the edges of knowledge, reminding us that history is not fixed but fluid, shaped by what is remembered and what is silenced. And so, the story moves toward its end. If Tartaria is myth, it tells us something about the power of imagination. If Tartaria is reality, it forces us to admit that an entire civilization can be erased. Either way, it remains a haunting presence, a civilization that might have been, or perhaps still lingers unseen in the margins of our collective memory. The final question, then, is not whether Tartaria was myth or reality, but what its persistence reveals about our relationship to the past, and what it means for us to dream of civilizations erased from history, a civilization that might have been. This is where Tartaria resides, not in the certainty of records or the permanence of ruins, but in the liminal space between what is known and what is imagined. It is the possibility of Tartaria that haunts, the idea that humanity may have once walked beside a vast and advanced empire whose memory was buried not by chance but by design. And perhaps that is why the name refuses to die. Though erased from maps, struck from encyclopedias, and dismissed by scholars, Tartaria lingers in whispers, in anomalies, and in the restless human imagination that senses something missing from the great story of civilization. If Tartaria existed, its scale would rival that of the largest empires in history. Its boundaries stretched across Siberia, Central Asia, and into Eastern Europe. It would have possessed cities, technologies, languages, and belief systems now almost entirely gone. To erase such a presence would require not only military conquest but deliberate rewriting, a suppression so thorough that only faint echoes remain. The absence of chronicles may itself be a kind of evidence, for silence on such a scale is rarely innocent. History is written by the victors, and the victors of Tartaria's lands were Russia, China, and the rising colonial powers of Europe. Yet Tartaria also teaches the limits of certainty. It could be that what Europeans called Tartaria was nothing more than a cartographic convenience, a vague label for lands they did not yet understand. The ruins, the buried architecture, the anomalies in geology, all may be coincidences, explained by natural processes or the ordinary cycles of history. If so, then Tartaria is myth, a phantom born of maps and misunderstanding. But even as myth, it holds value, for myths reveal truths about human perception. They show how people create coherence in the face of the unknown, how they project meaning onto empty spaces, and how they refuse to accept blankness in the story of the world. In the end, Tartaria may be both myth and reality. Perhaps there were indeed advanced societies across Eurasia, whose memory was fragmented and subsumed into the identities of larger empires. Perhaps the cartographers were not entirely mistaken when they inscribed Great Tartary across half the globe. What survives is neither complete proof nor total emptiness, but a mosaic of fragments, each piece hinting at a civilization we can glimpse but never fully grasp. Historians are still debating the meaning of Tartaria's persistence. Some see it as a conspiracy theory, others as an invitation to revisit overlooked histories. For those who dream of forgotten empires, Tartaria is proof that the past may still hold secrets. For skeptics, it is a reminder of the human tendency to weave stories from silence. For everyone, it is a mirror. What we see in Tartaria reflects what we most fear or desire, the fear that our knowledge is incomplete and the desire for mysteries yet unsolved. And so the story closes not with resolution but with resonance. Tartaria is less a chapter of history than a question. How much of the past is missing, and what else has been erased? The search for Tartaria is the search for memory itself, for the assurance that even if civilizations fall, they are never entirely gone. They remain in symbols, in songs, in stones buried beneath the earth, and in the restless imagination that refuses to forget. The mystery of Tartaria reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative but a living process. What we know today may be revised tomorrow. What we dismiss as myth may be uncovered as reality centuries later. The very act of asking whether Tartaria existed keeps it alive, turning silence into story, absence into possibility. And as the echoes fade, the idea remains. Somewhere, perhaps, beneath the soil or hidden in archives, lies the memory of a civilization that might have been. The story of Tartaria slows now, its questions trailing off like the dim light at the edge of dusk. The vast empire of the imagination, erased or invented, forgotten or concealed, has taken us across maps, ruins, symbols and stories. And whether Tartaria was real or only a shadow, its persistence shows how deeply humans long for mysteries, how eager we are to fill silences with wonder. Let the image fade gently. Star forts beneath overgrown grass, buried windows staring out from beneath the soil, and forgotten flags fluttering in a wind no one remembers. These visions need not be true to be powerful. They invite us to rest in possibility, to drift into the space between history and dream. As your breathing slows, let the weight of centuries settle lightly, not as burden, but as comfort. For every silence in history, there is a chance that something extraordinary once lived there, and even if Tartaria was only a phantom, it has offered us a journey across forgotten maps, half-buried ruins and whispered myths that reassures us the world is deeper than we know. So let go of the questions for tonight. Allow the mystery to remain unanswered, as mysteries sometimes must. Let the story of Tartaria dissolve into the quiet rhythm of sleep, where lost empires live on as dreams. Good night.